Hi again. This is week 7, remote learning, and this is the second part of the notes on the social injustices in Africa during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period. So, in this section, we're going to be talking about apartheid in South Africa along with the AIDS epidemic. So, we had talked about apartheid very briefly when we talked about imperialism. And apartheid is something specific to South Africa, and it had to do with racial discrimination that began when the Dutch landed in Cape Town in the 17th century. So, way long ago, the Dutch first came, and then the British took over after the Congress of Vienna. And remember, the British and the Dutch started warring, and then they were like, why don't we stick together. So the British and the Dutch stick together, and then they start implementing these really strict and racist policies against the native African people that lived in South Africa. And as time goes on, these policies get more and more strict. And when the British government officially leaves, that's when apartheid officially kicks in. So this again, apartheid is associated with racial discrimination. So in 1948, there were unwritten regulations that started to become written laws that prohibited marriage between whites and African people. And then laws even further got strict. They set specific housing reservation laws that forced Africans to live, Native African people to live in these ghetto neighborhoods, these like shanty neighborhoods that were in less desirable places that had lack of access to water and sewerage and food sources, that were overcrowded. They were filled with crime. They didn't have hospital facilities, proper educational facilities. And then what would happen is if you wanted to work in a white area of the country, you had to have specific documentation that was like a passport and other papers that had your work hours, where you lived, all where you're going, all these different details of your trip for every single time you crossed into white parts. So a lot of times people equate this to American segregation. Segregation in no right is good. It is not acceptable. But this apartheid is extreme segregation. It's very strict on the basis of race. So as apartheid goes on, more and more of these laws get passed. So it really begins fully in 1948. However, it carries on into the 1990s. So in 1961, after this violent riot where South Africans that are white openly fired on a group of black South Africans, the British decided to leave South Africa. Um, the British were like, the local government can't contain things, and we don't want to be associated with it. We can't pour any money into South Africa right now. So they decide that they are going to back out of maintaining any sort of control over South Africa. And it just makes things worse. So for the next 30 years, people who are associated with ending apartheid were put in prison. So the African National Congress was born to fight against this preferential treatment. Nelson Mandela was part of this group. And when they would be thrown in jail, it wouldn't be just like regular prison. Like Nelson Mandela was sent to this island off the coast where he was actually breaking rocks. So doing physical labor. And it, he was in prison with people who were utilizing passive resistance, peaceful tactics in order to overthrow the government. The African National Congress would be similar to our American Civil Rights Movement, where people are doing things, they're boycotting things, they are, standing up for their rights, but not in a violent manner. So Nelson Mandela, he was somebody who was a very important member of this. After he gets out from jail, he starts speaking about how South Africa be unified. And his leadership, so he is actually released from prison in 1990, and he is elected to be the first Democratic president in 1994 through government changes and work of the African National Congress by way of him in jail, and also by those who were out of jail and who are trying to negotiate with government officials in a peaceful manner to change South Africa. So Mandela, when he is released from prison, he becomes president, and his main goal is not to retaliate. His goal is to unify the people of South Africa under one country. This is the flag that they institute as they're working to settle the apartheid differences and move forward. There's a movie called Invictus that is all about this time period, about how are people going to use sports, rugby, to help heal the wounds of apartheid, to bring the country together and to see people as equal. So that's a good watch. You guys are going to be reading a poem, Invictus, which a lot of times is associated with apartheid. However, because it was quoted by Mandela often, it actually is not specifically about apartheid. So apartheid is over, but still, there's still racism in South Africa. And one of the ways you can definitely see it is in like television advertisement, magazines, movies that are created out of South Africa. About 78% of those people are white, where about 78% of South Africa is African. So, all right, we're going to talk about AIDS next. So, AIDS actually is a disease that originated in the Democratic Republic of the Congo around 1920. And there's scientific data that it was a disease that had jumped from monkeys to humans, just like other diseases do. The different flus and viruses can be, they basically they mutate is really the phrasing. So viruses and diseases can mutate over time so that they can attack different cells of different species. And AIDS is one of those mutated viruses. So there was very little data about AIDS and who transmitted it, how they got it, up until about the late 1970s. And by then, it had already started spreading across 5 continents. So there's a lot of stigmas around AIDS and those who have AIDS that need to be broken through time. HIV is, like nobody is looking to get HIV. It's something that is passed without people knowing their status, and that testing and monitoring of those who have AIDS, making sure they have the right antiretroviral medication, is the most important way to contain AIDS and HIV. So, knowing your status, staying up on that knowledge, and being proactive in the treatment of HIV is the best way to contain it. So, what happens with HIV is it's an infection, and you start with HIV, and eventually it turns into AIDS. Most people who develop HIV and that turn into AIDS do not die of HIV/AIDS. They actually end up dying of things like the flu or pneumonia, because what it does is it reduces your ability to fight infections. So without therapy, those who have HIV can rapidly progress to having AIDS in under 10 years. And those who once develop AIDS, the survival time is only 9.2 months. So if you have AIDS, which is an advanced form of HIV, without treatment, death is imminent. HIV is spread through bodily fluids. It can be spread through blood and from mother to child. 1/3 of all new HIV cases are through needle sharing. And I'm not just talking about recreational drug use. I'm talking about, too, in impoverished countries, the ability to sterilize needles and things just isn't the same as it is here. So you might go to the doctor's office and get a flu shot, and they would just take the needle and then put it in the um, put it in the medication and then administer it to somebody else. So availability of resources, sterilization, not sharing needles is very important in the prevention of HIV. Well, one other thing too about this is nowadays they have better ways of preventing that mother to child spread of HIV. They can give you antiretroviral drugs while the baby's in the womb. Also, too, by using cesarean section birth is a way to prevent that spread. So, AIDS in Africa. So, like, why is there so many more people living in sub-Saharan Africa who have HIV? So, what happened is, so HIV developed in this region, and it is assumed that there were so many people that were infected by the time people started keeping track of data on HIV/AIDS. And because these countries, for the most part, are very impoverished, it makes it really difficult for treatment to be administered in the appropriate manner and for education, like the knowledge of how to stop the spread to be handed out to people in the community. So it was already out of control by 1983, and there wasn't enough testing, there wasn't enough medication, there was so many people and just like not enough resources to get to everybody. Today, over 23 million people living in sub-Saharan Africa, which is like on the map here, this region here, anything south of the Sahara Desert, have HIV/AIDS, which is only about 5% of the population, but it's drastically higher than any other region on Earth. So this specific region has like pretty liberal attitudes towards sexual behavior, and they also have a lack of contraceptive. So the spread is pretty great in this region, and extra income is not available for people to get tested, to have contraceptive devices. And the idea that people too are very skittish about knowing their status because of that stigma. People don't want to be like, oh, I have HIV/AIDS, and now I have to go tell everybody that I have it, go get them tested. Where, realistically, some people, it's not necessarily from sexual encounters. It could be from needle sharing, doctors' offices, again, bodily fluids, things like that. So it's just, it's spread very quickly. In response to this widespread population that had HIV/AIDS, in 2006, the government tried to put forward this strategy called ABC, which was abstinence, which is not having sex. Be faithful. So if you are in a relationship, don't cheat on your spouse, um, and use contraceptives. This was enforced. There was billboards, pamphlets everywhere, but it was dismissed in 2010 due to lack of effectiveness. The ABC strategy, they weren't seeing reduced numbers of people with HIV. So in 2011, they started this educational tactic rollout, starting with kids at the age of 6. So, in school, everywhere, information about HIV and how to prevent it and how to treat it. So more of a holistic approach, not just like how to not get it, but also if you have it, what to do. And it's improved the life and the numbers a bit more than the ABC strategy, but they're still not where the WHO would like to see them. So that's all for today. So your assignment tomorrow is to look at some first person perspectives of apartheid in South Africa to get deeper into that. If you have any questions, let us know. Thanks.